Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. God willing, we are hopefully successfully streaming tonight, not only on YouTube, but also on Twitter Spaces. I think we have the things set up to work. I'm hoping that we do. If we don't, if you're on one of those platforms, please let us know, and we'll do everything that we can to rectify whatever kind of issues we're having. We are also, of course, recording this, and it's going to be available as a podcast right away as well. As is always the case, we're going to be breaking down the top 5 or so stories in Alberta politics and trying to provide a little bit of flavor, a little bit of context maybe. So, just want to mention as well before we get started, for our Patreon supporters, if you are one of the people that likes to use something called Discord, we do have our Discord channel set up exclusively for our Patreon supporters. We do have somebody on that tonight, so if I say something horrifically wrong, then that's a great place to let me know. The other thing, of course, as always, is once we get through the top 5 stories, we're going to be opening up the floor to anybody who wants to share any thoughts, correct anything that I said, provide any perspectives that I might have glossed over. And I feel optimistic, he said cautiously, that we have it figured out so that the audio will be able to be available to everyone, regardless of what kind of platform you're listening or watching on tonight. We would be remiss if we didn't start out with the fact that it's Stampede. As you can tell, I'm big into the cowboy cosplay. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Twitter, you probably can't tell at all. I'm wearing what I normally wear. But Stampede started off. This is the first Stampede since the beginning of COVID that there haven't been really any restrictions whatsoever. And that is certainly being reflected in the numbers that we're seeing in regards not only to Stampede attendance, but also for the parade. The parade reportedly actually had a record number of attendees. Now, we'll get into the nuance of that in a little bit, but it wasn't just the parade, because when we were putting the show together yesterday, so we don't have today's numbers, sorry, but when we were putting the show together yesterday, Friday also set an attendance record down at the grounds. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Stampede, Thursday's Sneak a Peek, Friday's the first major day of stampeding, and then it goes on for the next little while. But on Friday, the attendance records were actually broken. They set a whole new attendance record. And that's an interesting piece. There's a lot of people who are saying, you know, there's so many people who just wanted to get back to normal. They wanted to have a good old-fashioned Stampede free of COVID because we're clear of COVID now. And that got us wondering, how free of COVID are we actually? What do the numbers actually look like? So we spent a little bit of time and we went digging through some old CMOH tweets and some other stuff, and we were able to find out what the numbers were a year ago. So 1 year ago on July 8th, because that was the day that the record was set for the opening Stampede, 1 year ago on July 8th, this is what the COVID numbers looked like in Alberta. Now, the reason why this is important is because there were still some restrictions and protections in place. So, for example, employees at the Calgary Stampede were required to wear masks. If you wanted to go to any of the major concerts, you had to provide proof of vaccination. If you wanted to go to Nashville North, you had to provide proof of vaccination. So we wanted to get a sense, given that we are now having a Stampede that has none of those protective measures in place, how do the numbers compare? So, on July 8th of last year, there were 23 new cases reported in 24 hours. There were 697 active cases. There were 133 people in hospital, and there were 32 people in the ICU. Now, if you take a look at the sort of the peaks and flows of COVID, this was definitely at one of the lower periods for COVID. We were just coming out of a period of heavy restrictions. The Stampede coincided with a lot of those restrictions being lifted, but there were still some restrictions, like I said, in place on July 8th a year ago. What do the COVID numbers look like this year for the Stampede that has no protections whatsoever? Well, we know that for July 8th, there were 183 cases in 24 hours, comparing that to the 23 from the year before. We don't know the number of active cases, because they don't really provide that anymore, at least not in a place that was easily available to find. It's certainly not on the dashboard of the site. We do know that right now in Alberta, there are 568 people in hospital that are being included as part of the COVID numbers for the province of Alberta. So you compare that to 133 from the year before, it's a bit of an increase. Now, the one piece of good news is when it comes to the ICU numbers, there were 21 people in the ICU this year on July 8th compared to the 32 the year before, which fits because one of the big things that's happened in the last year is a lot more people got vaccinated, which is really, really great because it decreases the likelihood of people having really, really severe outcomes. But as we can clearly see, the numbers that we have, the numbers that are on the Alberta government website, are significantly higher than what they were a year ago. Now, this has a lot of people really concerned, and there's a lot of people expressing concerns on traditional media, on social media, because the question is, Dr. Hinshaw has said in the past that with the testing being effectively largely eliminated, if you want to know what the actual number of COVID cases are approximately in the province of Alberta, you have to take whatever the number is that they've given you and multiply it by 10. So that means that there's a lot more cases going on than has been reported. Now, secondary to that, the current variant that we're dealing with is actually way more infectious than the variant that we had a year ago. So there's a lot of people who are saying that we're going to be watching the COVID numbers very, very closely. But perhaps the most uneasy, I'll say, because I'm probably going to overuse alarming tonight, but perhaps the most uneasy reality has to do with wastewater. Now, it's hard to see on the graph that I've thrown up on the screen here, but if you take a look, just a couple of days ago, the wastewater COVID numbers started ticking back up again. And so now we're going into an event where there's a lot of outdoor stuff, which is good, but there's also a whole lot of indoor stuff. There's a lot of very, very densely packed crowds, and we're dealing with a variant that's way more infectious. So it's going to be something that we need to be watching very closely, particularly because, as we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the show, the state of the healthcare system isn't exactly great these days. But before we get to that, we wanted to talk about one of the other big pieces that's going on this week. Tamara Lich, and I think that's how it's pronounced. I've heard so many different versions of how her name is pronounced, but the one I hear most commonly is Lich, so that's the one I'm going to go with. Tamara Lich started off the week, kind of, if you're a Tamara Lich fan, we should probably have a talk, but if you're a Tamara Lich fan, Drew Barnes tweeted out that Tamara Lich was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, on its face, everybody's heard of the Nobel Peace Prize. Most people know what the Nobel Peace Prize is, or they have a vague understanding of what it is. But what most people don't realize is how incredibly easy it is to get nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Now, one of the other things that happened to Ms. Leach is she was shipped out to the East in order to be heard on a bail hearing because she attended an event that was explicit against her bail rules. It was explicitly said, you can't do these things. She went ahead and did these things, took a bunch of pictures. The police said, well, we warned you, took her back out there, and she got her bail denied. Now, there's a lot of people who are saying, political prisoner, but it's actually really simple. If you get bail, you've been charged with something, and you get bail, you have bail conditions. And part of those conditions that you agree to, under oath, mind you, is that there's certain things that I won't do. And depending on what you were charged with, it's going to depend on what the judge decides those conditions are. Well, one of Tamara Leach's conditions was you can't be seen to be promoting anything anti-vax or convoy or anything like that. And I should have mentioned, for anyone who's not familiar with Tamara Lich, she was one of the, if not the biggest organizers of the trucker convoy that went out and shut down Ottawa. And depending on whose accounts you listen to, some people were hoping there would be some sort of a coup that happened there. There were people that were saying they wanted it to be Canada's January 6th, which is deeply, deeply alarming. We also saw Nazi flags being flown up there. So to say that that event was a little bit problematic is probably a bit of an understatement. But Tamara Lich broke her bail hearings And in the wake of the Nobel Peace Prize nomination, there were a lot of people who were saying she's a political prisoner. The Trudeau government is afraid of Tamara Lich. I have a hard time wrapping my head around that one personally, but that was the claim. Now, one of the things that's really important to contextualize, though, especially if somebody's going to roll out the argument that, well, she got nominated for the Peace Prize. And the reason why this is relevant to Alberta politics is because Tamara Lich is from Alberta. But it's also relevant to Alberta politics because there's quite a few leadership race candidates who have decided to hold her up as an example of the type of Albertan that they want to see more of for reasons that I can't wrap my head around. But that's what they've said. I mean, we saw Danielle Smith come out and say that one of the reasons why she wanted her Alberta Autonomy Act and one of the reasons why she wants her own police force that will do whatever she tells them to is so that people like Tamara Lich can't be extradited out east. And part of the rationale has to do with, well, she was nominated for a Peace Prize. Let's take a look real quick. Let's just take a quick look at some of the other people who have been nominated for Peace Prizes over the years. I hate to get to Godwin's Law this early in the show, but Adolf Hitler was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Joseph Stalin was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Mussolini was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Putin was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Getting nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize just means that somebody who has a certain degree of political clout said, yeah, I'll put that name in the hat. But it has nothing to do, obviously, when we're including names like Stalin and Putin and Mussolini and, of course, Hitler. It obviously does not speak to the validity of the work that that person did in regards to advancing peace in the world. So the Tamara Lich Nobel Peace Prize thing is nothing but a big, ridiculous smokescreen. In Canada, we should have rule of law, which is if you break the law, you obviously get a court hearing, you get to defend your actions, you get to defend your choices or try to justify them. But at the end of the day, you're still held responsible. And if you are found to have broken the law, then you deal with the consequences of that. What we've seen from the convoy and people like Tamara Lich over and over and over again is that they believe that the rules just don't apply to them because freedom or something. Never mind the fact that in more than a few recent studies, Canada was rated by far in the top 10 or the top 5 of freest countries in the world. We're really not doing that bad. Moving on from there, though. There's been an ongoing court case, and we've talked a little bit about this on the show over the last little while. So one of the things that happened when Dr. Henshaw announced that she was removing the requirement for masking in schools, and in fact, Adrienne Leno-Grange took it a step farther and said she was forbidding schools to require masking. One of the things that happened with all of that is there were a lot of vulnerable kids who were put, and their parents who were put in a really terrible position because they had to then choose, well, do we send our kids back to school knowing that there's not going to be any kind of mandatory masking, or do we come up with something else? And so that group of parents, there's a group of parents as well as the Alberta Federation of Labor that have initiated a court case against the province, trying to determine what was the justification, what was the rationale. And ultimately, one of the things that I think everybody largely knows that they're trying to prove is whether or not, I should say trying to establish, is whether or not the decisions to remove the masking in schools was based on actual evidence or based on actual political expediency. And there's a lot of people. I mean, we've made more than a few jokes about it. Of course, it was political expediency to any reasonable measure. But to the credit of this family and the AFL, they are going the long distance to make sure that the actual evidence is presented. Now, the Alberta government has gone out of their way to not be transparent on what's been going on and what drove these decisions. In one of the initial submissions, Dr. Henshaw came out and she was like, yeah, here's what I can give you. And the judge said, not good enough. And just recently, this week, the judge again came out and said, you know what? There's some stuff that you guys have said that is cabinet confidential. It can't be released. I think it can. The judge has demanded that those documents get reviewed. One of those documents is his PowerPoint presentation that apparently Dr. Henshaw delivered to cabinet. There's also some cabinet minutes that are required to be released. Now, where it stands right now is the government does have the ability to appeal and say, well, but we really, really don't want to, which is what they've kind of said already. Worth noting that one of the arguments that was put forward, one of the letters that was put forward, came from Justice Minister Tyler Shandro. So I don't know if this judge has to worry about somebody showing up in his driveway or anything like that. But they do have the ability to appeal. But pretty consistently, this judge has been doing a very good job of saying, hey, you know what, your logic in this particular instance, it doesn't fly. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see how that plays out, because as you can see, there is an actual order saying this is what has to be released. This is when it has to be released by. You've got until this date to do your appeal. Otherwise, here we go. And it's going to be interesting to see how that whole thing unfolds. Moving on from there. One of the other things that has come up a lot in the last couple of weeks has to do with the whole question of Roe versus Wade being overturned in the States. And one of the things that we have heard conservative politicians and I can't even call it anti-women's health care advocates saying is, you know what, guys, it's an American thing. It's all cool. Nothing to worry about. We're in Canada. This doesn't affect Canada at all. It's no big deal. Well, it turns out that's not quite true. The CMPA, or the Canadian Medical Protective Association, is a body that provides legal advice to physicians in Canada. And it was released on Twitter, and they released a statement saying very clearly, hey, docs, we might actually have a bit of a situation here. Because one of the things that's going on is there's a bunch of states in the U.S. who are saying if somebody goes to Canada or anywhere else and gets an abortion, because you won't be able to get them in these states because we're moving backwards in time, but if that's what happens, then that state is crafting laws that will allow them to charge those physicians with breaking the law in those states. So a doctor in Canada performs an abortion on a patient who came up to Canada to get an abortion, and if that doctor sets foot in that state that has written that law that says any doctors that perform any abortions on anywhere will be charged, the CMPA is saying we don't know how that's going to play out. So in and of itself, right there, without having any court cases, without having anything else going on, right there, that has a very chilling effect on the conversation in regards to abortion and women's health care here in Canada, because there are now physicians that are going to potentially have to worry about, well, if I do this thing, if I provide this healthcare service, is this going to be something that if I ever go to, I don't know, pick the state. I have a bunch in my head that I want to choose from, but I don't have I don't have in front of me what the actual states are that are trying to pursue this kind of legislation, and I don't want to throw anyone under the bus unfairly. But if this physician ever decides to go for vacation in whatever that state was, they have to worry about, am I going to be the test case for this? Am I going to find out that I'm going to get arrested because I performed an abortion, a procedure that's legal in Canada, on somebody who came to Canada? Am I going to get arrested for that? So the whole idea that the legal situation in the United States has no impact whatsoever on Canadians is bunk. There's a lot of people who are very, very concerned about even just reopening that conversation. And we've certainly seen, I put out a tweet of my own a year and change ago when I was running in the municipal election, where I was getting emails from anti-women's healthcare groups, and they were trying to pressure me into saying at a municipal level. So it's federal, but at a municipal level, they wanted to know where I stood on these issues. Now, I, of course, released that email publicly, and thankfully I lost that election, so I don't have to worry about any of that stuff. But the reality is there are groups that are trying to influence and pressure politicians across all levels of government here in Canada. So to try to say that the situation with Roe versus Wade has nothing to do with anything here in Canada is either disingenuous or naive or probably a little bit of both. Moving on from there, I promised we were going to talk about healthcare. Here we are. We saw with Stampede again, we saw that on Friday night, just before Friday night, sorry, it was announced that Airdrie Urgent Care was going to be operating on limited hours, and they were going to be operating on those limited hours because they didn't have any physicians available to work the overnight shift. Now, for a little bit of context, an urgent care, from what we've been able to tell, is effectively an emergency room that just doesn't admit people. If they have somebody who comes in there and they need to be admitted to the hospital because they're having something that wouldn't just normally be dealt with in an emergency room, then they'll ship them off to a hospital. But urgent cares are effectively emergency rooms that provide emergency care for people. Now, in the Calgary area, there's really only two 24-hour urgent care centers. It's also worth noting that urgent care centers do a really good job of taking a lot of pressure off of the major hospitals, because if I have a minor thing that doesn't require me to go to one of the major hospitals like the Foothills or the Peter Lougheed, then I can just go to that. I can go to one of the urgent care centers. I can get whatever I need to have done there, and I don't plug up one of the major hospitals like the Foothills, which is the trauma center for Southern Alberta. Well, Friday night, Saturday night, we don't know how long, Airdrie Urgent Care isn't open on nights. They're closing overnight. And it's also worth noting that this is happening, of course it is, during the first week of Stampede, which is traditionally one of the busiest times for first responders. And in fact, we've gotten more than a couple of tweets aimed at us and more than a couple of DMs since we started talking about this from first responders saying that some of the wait times that they're seeing, especially for ambulances, are some of the longest. We had a message from a firefighter in the Calgary area who he's been in the job for, I don't want to say very long time, but it's been a while. I don't want to say very long time because I'll get in trouble for calling him old in effect. But he's been a firefighter for a very long time, and he's already said Friday night was one of the worst nights that he's seen for EMS delays. Now, this also comes on the heels of Friday night, HSAA EMS, the Twitter account for the Health Sciences Association of Alberta, tweeted out saying that 20 ambulances, we're not talking about 20 staff members, we're talking about 20 ambulances, were dropped from the schedule on Friday and shut down due to short staffing. So on the very first Friday of Stampede, not only do we have Airdrie Urgent Care closing down, but we've also got a shortage, apparently, of 20 ambulances on a Friday. Now, we haven't independently verified what HSAA has said, but you'd better believe that the union that is involved with paramedics in the province of Alberta is going to dot their T's and cross their I's well in advance of putting anything like that out, because I don't want to be the person holding the legal responsibility for something like that. But it's obviously a very serious situation in healthcare right now. But it's not just limited to EMS, because there was also a tweet that came out where somebody was highlighting the situation in hospitals. And they showed a picture of the scheduling problems that were going on for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Well, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And on those days, they were demonstrating that there are chunks where there are some shifts where they're down one employee. They don't have anyone to fill that one shift. They have some where they're down 2 shifts. They have some where they're down 5 shifts. And there's some where they're down 8. They have 8 vacancies for a specific shift. The entirety, right, of healthcare right now is in crisis. This is something that's been talked about at length. And unfortunately, it's one of the issues during Stampede, no less, that is getting some of the least amount of attention, which is why we wanted to talk about it a little bit. Moving on from there, the biggest political event, and I know that we've talked about this at length on the show, and we're going to continue talking about it until I think it's October 6th, is the UCP leadership race. And we're talking about the UCP leadership race for a lot of different reasons, but one of them is, quite literally, whoever wins that race is going to be the next premier of Alberta, and some of the candidates, they've had a bit of a bumpy week. So we saw at the very beginning of the week, the news broke that former Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall knew one of the people who was involved in the convoy to Ottawa, and he was texting advice to that person on how to manage PR and what they should do next and all of that kind of thing. And there were a lot of people who had a lot of questions about just that alone. I mean, at one point, even Brad Wall called it an occupation. And anybody who's being realistic in the situation knows it absolutely was an occupation. But the timing of what happened next was really quite remarkable because UCP leadership candidate Rebecca Schultz came out with an endorsement from Brad Wall within 24 hours of that story breaking. Now, there's a lot of people who looked at it and said, you know what, it was probably scheduled. They probably had a scheduled Facebook post and scheduled tweet, and all of the social media things were all scheduled. What are you going to do? Well, you can unschedule them. I'm just spitballing here, but as an idea, that's a possibility. But nonetheless, that was Rebecca Schultz's big endorsement announcement for the week. But there were lots of other endorsements that went on as well. We saw Pete Guthrie, who's an MLA in the Airdrie area. He endorsed Danielle Smith. He went up to an event of hers, and then he actually did a big, long endorsement video where he talked about Danielle's great, I guess. Now, there's some dissonance here that's worth exploring, because Pete was actually one of the MLAs who actually supported health protections during the peak of COVID. He's one of the MLAs who came out and said, you know what, we need to be taking care of each other. We need to not be divisive. And here he is supporting Danielle Smith, who by really any objective measure has got to be one of the most divisive leadership candidates that we've seen in this province in a long time. And I might add, she's the front runner. Mr. Guthrie took a whole bunch of slack as well this week because it was released on social media that there was one of his constituents had gone to see him regarding concerns about the EMS situation. And they said, hey, you know, there's this paramedic who's done this FOIP stuff, and we're really quite concerned because, and we've blocked out the paramedic's name on the graphic that's on the screen right now, but we're really quite concerned because what he's telling us and what the data he seems to have from these FOIPs is really quite scary. Mr. Guthrie, would you please look into it? Well, in the loosest of senses, Mr. Guthrie did, because by all accounts, he then sent an email to the chief paramedic, the boss of bosses of paramedics, and said, hey, there's this guy who's saying these things, and we don't know how he got this information, but somebody should probably look into that. So it appears that when a constituent brought forward concerns that were legitimately gathered through the Freedom of Information Act process, Mr. Guthrie turned around and tried to, in effect, it seems like, throw him under the bus. But there was lots more drama in regards to the leadership race and endorsements. We saw the Progressive Group of Independent Businesses put up a Facebook post asking for volunteers because they've apparently decided that they're going to use their offices as campaign and phoning locations for not just a provincial campaign, but a federal one as well. They're supporting Danielle Smith and Leslyn Lewis, and they were using the offices and the resources of the Progressive Group of Independent Businesses and the main guy who's people know his name in Calgary for sure, and in Alberta for sure, Craig Chandler. He was putting out a call for volunteers, and he was saying, if you want to volunteer for Leslyn, call this number. If you want to volunteer for Danielle, call this number. Now, there's actually some pretty strict rules about companies and organizations explicitly donating to or supporting leadership candidates. There were a bunch of financial changes that were made. So even if there's not an actual cash endorsement going on, this certainly appears to be a donation, have the potential of being a donation in kind. And perhaps there's no place that it's more evident than the fact that if you go to the PGIB's website, they have a contact phone number listed to get a hold of them. That phone number is the exact same phone number that they're asking people to call if you want to support Danielle Smith. I don't know, maybe they haven't, clearly they haven't updated their website in a while, but it's certainly alarming more than a little bit that you have this organization. It's a registered corporation. That's what it says on the website. that is actively soliciting for volunteers for leadership candidates provincially and federally. They appear to be using their own corporate resources, which would, by any reasonable measure, appear to be a donation in kind. And I think what's most telling, though, is that those two candidates appear to be okay with it. But what's even more telling is the fact that Mr. Chandler has had no shortage of problematic things to say over the year. He's gone after religious groups, and he stood by those comments. He's had some pretty startling things to say about Muslims. Most recently, he had some things to say about China. So he put up a Facebook post where he said, "There's nothing about China or its people that is redeeming at all. We should buy nothing from these savages." His words, not mine. They have no respect for life of any sort. It's also from 2020, a post that says, "I say we close the border to any nation that would do this. China has caused so many problems for us and are sick and twisted." It's kind of surprising that people like Danielle Smith would be okay with somebody who has, as recently as a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, said some profoundly racist things about ethnic groups. But I guess Danielle's okay with that. Danielle herself has had a bit of a challenging week. It seems like a lot of UCP candidates are reading the future in the worst way possible, because as we saw going into this weekend, there was a huge Rogers blackout that affected not only Rogers customers, but literally anyone wanting to buy anything anywhere in Canada, because Interac went down. Well, only a couple of days before that, Danielle Smith she was complaining about the new internet censorship law that Justin Trudeau is rolling out. And we talked about this last week. There is no internet censorship law. There's no such law. There's no laws before the House. There's no laws before the Senate. It doesn't exist. The only thing that's going before the potentially becoming a law right now is Bill C-11, and that has to do with Canadian content and making sure that Canadian content gets put out there more aggressively than American or other countries' content. But there's no censorship. That's not to be found anywhere. But it seems to be a drum that Danielle Smith likes to bang on a lot. So she put out a tweet where she said, "Hey, at Elon Musk, I'm running to be the Premier of Alberta. We still value free speech here. Could Alberta set up an independent ISP or internet service provider using Starlink to bypass the new Justin Trudeau internet censorship law?" Well, again, like I just finished saying, no such thing. I didn't see a reply from Elon. We couldn't find one. But this is another comment in a history of comments from Danielle Smith that are really problematic. Just a little while ago, when Danielle Smith was leader of the Wild Rose, she suggested, during the midst of the E. coli outbreak and scandal, where there was a bunch of tainted beef with E. coli, that, well, we could just feed it to the homeless people, couldn't we? And she put that out in a tweet. There's a picture making the rounds on social media right now of an article that Danielle Smith published when she was writing for the Calgary Herald. And in that article, and I'm not making this up, she argued that the anti-smoking groups are doing more harm than good because, don't you know, smoking reduces the risks of traditional disease by 75%. Now, obviously, that is patently not true. It has been known since the 50s and the 60s that smoking unquestionably causes all kinds of harm, and it certainly doesn't provide any sort of health benefits by reducing traditional disease, unless you're making the argument, I suppose, that if you smoke more, you have a higher probability of dying earlier, so maybe you won't get any of those traditional diseases. That's my best guess. We also saw just a little while ago, at the beginning of COVID in 2020, Danielle Smith and her famous hydroxychloroquine tweet, where she said, "Breaking! New controlled clinical study conducted by doctors in France shows that hydroxychloroquine cures 100% of coronavirus patients within 6 days of treatment." Now, this is when she still had a radio show, and she was arguably at the height of her popularity. She had tremendous reach, and she saw fit to go ahead and put that out there for reasons, I guess. Now, we've said on the show before that sometimes people do say problematic things on social media. And sometimes it's the result of being really angry. Sometimes it's the result of getting bad information. But if you say something that's demonstrably and factually wrong, the right thing to do is say, whoops, my bad. I apologize. It doesn't even have a question to do with whether or not you offended anyone. If you say something that's just demonstrably false and is going to lead people to, I don't know, eat horse paste, maybe that's the kind of thing that you should immediately say, I guess I shouldn't have done that. What we see from Danielle Smith isn't a one-off tweet. It isn't a one-off social media post. It is a repeated history of saying patently false, outrageous things that have no value. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who do believe it. And when you have somebody like Danielle Smith who's saying these things, and in a lot of circles going unchallenged, there are other people who are going to start to drink that particular brand of Kool-Aid too. And we saw this from Tavis Taves, where he came out after it was announced that there's a high probability that Canadians are going to require boosters in order to keep themselves safe from COVID. There's a high probability that you're going to have to get a booster every 9 to 12 months in order to keep yourself safe from COVID, especially because we have all of these evolving variants, much like we get a yearly flu shot. Well, Mr. Taves saw fit to put up the graphic, 2 doses are no longer enough from Ottawa, and then Travis Taves looking like he's having some kind of, I don't know, uncomfortable bowel movement, saying enough is enough. I find myself wondering, when was Travis Taves' last meal? And what was it? Because if you only should ever have to do something once, I assume it was a long time ago. I'd like to know how he's keeping up with his figure, given that he clearly isn't eating because you wouldn't want to have to do something more than once. He's not drinking any kind of water because you wouldn't want to have to do something more than once. It is such an incredibly flawed argument, and yet we are seeing it spread like wildfire throughout the UCP leadership race. And that's a big problem. One of the other questions that's come up a lot lately is how come this isn't really being covered by traditional media? And there's a lot of different answers for that. There's no simple solution. There's no simple explanation. And to be clear, as we have at the top of our bios on all of our things, we are not journalists. We have never pretended to be journalists. We have never claimed to be journalists. We do commentary, we do satire, we do jokes, but we are absolutely not presenting ourselves as journalists. Please don't mistake us as such. But there are a lot of people who are wondering, how come the mainstream media isn't talking about some of these things? And I cannot tell you how much it drives me crazy to utter a phrase like mainstream media. But just recently, we tweeted out this video.
COVID killed people, a lot of people. But so did the vaccine, and so did the mandates.
Now that video obviously comes with everything he said is wrong. I mean, it reminds me that the scene in Star Wars where Luke Skywalker just says it's remarkable how every word in that was wrong. COVID has killed a lot of people, so I guess he gets that part right. But in regards to the vaccines killing people, that's demonstrably false. In regards to the mandates killing people, that's hyperbolic at the most generous reading, if not false. But here we have a candidate for the UCP leadership race. And that video picked up and ran through social media. The last time that we looked at the video counts on our tweet, it has over 155,000 views. And it also has a boatload of people who have shared the video. And on almost all of those, there's the question, why isn't the mainstream media covering this? Why aren't they talking about this more? This is dangerous and false, and it should be highlighted. And I think part of the reason that might be happening is because of the relationship between journalists and politicians, or media and politicians, or satirical hack podcasts and politicians. Because shortly after we put up this video,
we need to make sure that we have a conservative prime minister that makes the right choices for the Supreme Court, which is ultimately what has been ignored by many conservative governments. I'm sorry, but it has, and it needs to be thought of at the forefront in the background of any decision you make. We need to stop the Supreme Court from weakening people's rights. That means electing a conservative prime minister for certain and working towards that, and understanding that selecting judges and the Supreme Court judges are the most important thing we can do as a prime minister to have that influence on getting that done. So we have people that align with their thoughts.
Now, that comment came from the day before the Roe versus Wade decision was announced, bearing in mind that it was leaked weeks prior that was going to be the Roe versus Wade decision. So there's no question that everybody knew it was coming. And yet Brian Jean decided that it was appropriate to stand up in front of an audience and a camera that was connected to the internet and say, well, what we really need to do is stack the Supreme Court with people who agree with our opinions. Because that's exactly what led to Roe versus Wade, as well as a lot of the other controversial court opinions that we've seen come from the Supreme Court in the United States render. That's exactly what caused it. It was a campaign that went on for decades within the conservative movement and within the religious right to make sure that that was an issue that got before the right Supreme Court judges, no pun intended. Shortly after that video went up, we got a call from Mr. Jean's campaign manager, and this goes to why perhaps the media, journalists, don't go after these comments as aggressively as some people want them to. Because Mr. Jean's campaign manager, his media guy, whatever, he said, hey, I know that you've extended an invitation to Mr. Jean. He will absolutely not be coming on your show. He won't have anything to do with you because you put this video up. Now, we're a small-time podcast. We're a web series now as well because we're streaming on YouTube. Hey, everybody. But we're a small-time organization. And the fact that this guy, who's been a political operator for a very, very long time, the first tool in his toolkit was to say, I'm going to limit your access, speaks to something that we've heard from a lot of journalists where they've talked about the fact that if you go too hard after someone, then you won't get access to that person. And there's always that tightrope of balancing whether or not you're going to get access to that person. Now, we are pleased to announce that we do have our sights on another interview with another UCP leadership candidate, which will bring us to 3. Although Bill Rock is out, so I don't know. I feel like he still counts. He was a declared candidate when we interviewed him. But we do have somebody who said that they're going to appear on the show probably next week, so we're excited about that. But the other thing that we want to let everybody know is, we invited Mr. Kenny on the show, Jason Kenny. Onto the show. He declined. We did have multiple long-term appearances from not Jason Kenny, though. And we might be having interviews with, I don't know, not Brian Jean, maybe not Danielle Smith. Could be interesting. Hard to say. But that's probably a big part of the reason why you don't see the aggressive coverage that you do. There also, there's lots of people who talk about the corporate ownership of journalists. There's lots of people. I mean, we've had guests on the show who talked about the fact that because they went after a particular story, they were let go from their job. Because they pushed back, they were let go from their job. This is a thing that happens. We're not going to be journalists. We're not going to try to be journalists, but we will continue to try to do the very best commentary and satire that we can. And if politicians don't like us, I think that maybe means we're doing something right. I don't know. We got a special treat tonight, though. Before we open it up to the floor, if anybody wants to weigh in from the Twitter machine, we got a little something for you, a little treat. People have been asking, "Where's everybody else, Nate? Where's the other folks that have been on the show? Where's Aaliyah?" Well, Aaliyah's been a little busy. She's had some things on the go, and right now she's in North Saskatchewan. But we were able to get in touch with Aaliyah. In North Saskatchewan, despite the Rogers outage, which she was actually affected by. And Aaliyah's been working on putting together a story, if you will, not a journalistic story, just a story, a package, a video section where she's been taking a look at all of the valid arguments that exist in regards to abortion. And she put that all together, and we're very, very excited to share that with you right now.
Hey Nate, it's Aaliyah. I'm just popping in here from North Saskatchewan to remind you that a woman's body is her choice all the time. I have a uterus, and it's none of your business or concern what happens inside of it or doesn't. Also, if it's not your uterus, just because you have one, doesn't mean that you get to inflict your decisions on other people with uteruses. And the fact that we are still having this conversation is a little sad. It is 2022. If it's it's not your uterus, it's really not your decision. To clarify, if the uterus in question is not the one in you, not your problem. Don't worry about it. Let the person with the uterus do the decisions. They know best. They've had it for a while. That's it. That's all. Hi from Saskatchewan.
So there you go, Aaliyah Coleman, everybody. It was really good to get Aaliyah back on the show for just a little bit, and we're going to try to get her on more frequently going forward. But that's really it for what we have for this week. If there's anybody who wants to throw any comments in from the Twitterverse, feel free to click the little microphone thing in the bottom left-hand side. If you don't, that's okay too. We'll give it a couple of seconds. I'll do the obligatory room-clearing plug while we wait to see if anybody wants to, and that plug is, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, we would love nothing more than if you signed up to be one of our supporters at our Patreon site at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for as little as $5 a month, I feel like the ShamWow guy now when I'm doing this. For little as $5 a month, you can help us to continue to provide get the kind of toys that we need in order to be able to stream to YouTube and do the Twitter Spaces and have those two things talk to each other, and all the other things that we try to do as well. So again, that website, www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab. I want to say a big thank you to everybody who is supporting us on Patreon, but I also want to say thank you to everybody who just listens to or watches the show. It means a lot that people do that, and we do work hard on these things. And I think that's really all that we have. Nobody's raised their hand, so we'll probably call it a day there again. We will be back next Sunday. And we'll probably have some wonderful things to talk about in regards to the Stampede. I hope not, but you never know. In the meantime, be kind, and just keep the conversation going.